What is up? Welcome to my screencast tutorial on working off DOM with elements in JavaScript. A very useful process, just so you know, in case you ever have to go through it for whatever reason. Before we get started, this is a link to the slide deck that you're seeing on your screen right now. It lives online. And along with containing a link to this tutorial's final code on GitHub, the deck also contains links to some really useful articles and blog posts, which I think will help you in furthering your understanding on how to work off DOM with elements in JavaScript. So go to this deck online whenever you want to and go through the links. I know they'll help you, but let's get started with this tutorial. You may find yourself in a position one day where you have to use JavaScript to dynamically create some web page elements and then load them onto a web page. And here's an example of what the code for that would look like. So let's say there's a div on my page, an empty div like I have here with an ID name of box. And let's say I want to dynamically create a text string and then load that text string into this div. I can do that. The way I'm doing it here is I've created a variable called myBox, and inside of this variable is a reference to that div with an ID name of box. I am creating that reference using the ever popular document.getElementById way of things. And then I have to dynamically create my text node. And the way I'm doing that here is creating a variable here called myText, and inside of that variable I'm running the createTextNode method, which creates our simple text string, which in this case is hello world. And then to load that text string into the div, I have to run the appendChild method here. And what appendChild is doing is loading in our text string, which is referenced by this myText variable, into our div with an ID name of box, which is referenced by this myBox variable here. And the end result is this block of code that I have highlighted right here. As you can see, our div is no longer empty, and it contains our text string. Now, let's say later on down the line, I want to add a break tag to the inside of our div. We can totally do that. The way I'm doing it here is I'm creating a variable called myBreak, and inside of that variable, I'm running the createElement method to create an element. In this case, that element is a break tag. And in order to load that break tag into my div, I've got to use the appendChild method again to load in the break tag, which is referenced by this myBreak variable, into the div with an ID name of box, which is referenced by this myBox variable. And the end result of this code is what's highlighted here. As you can see, the break tag is now in our div, and it's at the bottom of the stack inside of that div. That's a very important point. Let me explain it. Anytime you use appendChild to load stuff inside of a web page element, appendChild is going to load the stuff to the bottom of the stack of the element. Definitely bookmark that in your brain if you can, because it's a very important concept for you to understand. So basically what we did was we created a web page elements one at a time, and then we loaded them onto our web page one at a time. But we should avoid doing that when we can, because every time we did that stuff one at a time, we triggered what's known as a reflow. And a reflow is a change to your page's structure in any way, a change in its geometry. So by us adding web page elements to our web page, we created a reflow. And since we did two of them, each one at a time, we created two reflows. But even if we removed content from that page, we would trigger a reflow as well. And if we did it multiple times, like say if we removed 5 elements from our web page, we just triggered 5 reflows. Let me clear up some terminology here. The process that I just described is Mozilla calls it a reflow. WebKit and I think also IE and Opera call it a layout. I like the term reflow, so it's going to be the term that I use throughout the rest of this tutorial. Now, along with triggering reflows, adding stuff one at a time when we did it, it also triggered what's known as a repaint. And a repaint is a stylistic change to your web page elements as well as adjustments to the physical browser window. So say I've got some copy on my page that's black, I could use JavaScript to access that copy's.style property and change that copy from black to red. But if I do that, I trigger a repaint. Also, if I change my browser's dimensions, change its width or its height in any way, or if I even scroll in any direction, that also triggers a repaint. And you should definitely avoid, you should definitely try to minimize the amount of reflows and repaints going on your page, because the more reflows and repaints going on your page, the slower, less responsive your web page will be. So what sort of code can we write to minimize our reflows and repaints? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to go off DOM. By that I mean go inside of our browser's memory, not on our web page. We're going to create a bunch of web page elements, lay them out the way we want to lay them out, and then load them into something called a document fragment. The document fragment is going to take all of our web page elements over to our web page as a whole. It's going to wrap them all up, and then take them over there. And since all of our content is wrapped up in this document fragment, which is like a wrapper, it's as if we're only moving one thing instead of multiple things. We're moving a group of things instead of like moving stuff over one at a time. And in doing so, we're only triggering one reflow and one repaint. And after we load that content onto the page, we're then going to duplicate it using something called the cloneNode method. And what that's going to do is we're going to duplicate this content, go back off DOM, rearrange the content the way we want it rearranged, and then load it back onto a web page. It's also going to be wrapped up as a group and moved over. And in doing so, that also only triggers one reflow and one repaint. Now, the appendChild method is going to be used very heavily in our code. AppendChild is buggy, particularly on IE9 and lower. In fact, if you go through this deck, you'll come across some links to articles written by some really smart people like Steve Souders, who tell us why appendChild sort of sucks. Well, it does suck. I do want to point out that even though it sucks when you use appendChild on DOM. We're going to be using appendChild off DOM. So we should be okay, and it shouldn't suck, but I am going to suggest that if you use appendChild in your code, test it on as many web browsers and web devices as possible. Now, let me just say one thing. Basically, the starting block of code that we're creating, what we're doing essentially is using JavaScript to script in some web page elements on our web page. It's definitely more efficient if you were to physically type the web page elements onto your web page instead of creating them and then loading them onto your page with JavaScript. But this is a tutorial where we're here to learn new stuff, so we're going to learn how to use document fragments. Now, to test our work, we're going to need a really good browser-based web developer tool, something like Google Chrome DevTools or Firebug for Firefox or Opera Dragonfly. Because anytime we load content onto our web page elements, we're not going to be able to see them if we do a simple view source. We are going to be able to see them if we have a really good browser-based web dev tool with a really good DOM viewer. So the three tools that I just mentioned will definitely help you out here. I'm going to be using the dev tools inside of Google Chrome Canary. Google Chrome Canary is the beta version of Chrome. It's usually 2 versions or so ahead of whatever the current release of Chrome is. And because of that, its dev tools are slightly more advanced than whatever the current release of Chrome is at that time. But you can use wherever you want. I'm going to be using the ones inside of Google Chrome Canary. Now, the end result of the code that we're creating is what you see here. As you can see, we've got 2 boxes, one on the top, one on the bottom. Each box has a red dash outline border. The box at the top represents the content we're going to create the first go-round using document fragment. The box at the bottom represents the content that we're going to create for the second go-round when we use cloneNode. And let's actually start creating some code here. Excuse me, oops, went to the wrong spot. So this is going to be the web page where we load our content into. Specifically, we're going to load all of our content inside of this div with an ID name of container. We have a reference to the core jQuery library. Yes, we need jQuery to do some stuff. We've got a reference to this scripts.js file, which is where we're going to write our code. And then we've got a reference to this styles.css file right here. And let's look at that CSS file for a minute. Inside of this CSS file, we have 4 IDs and 1 class that I want to point out. The first ID is OuterBox1, the second one is OuterBox2. As you can see, OuterBox1 and OuterBox2 share the same CSS properties. The third ID is InnerBox1, the fourth ID is InnerBox2, and there is a class here at the bottom called BlueBG. These 4 IDs and 1 class we're going to attach, when we create our web page elements off DOM, we're going to attach these 4 IDs in one class to those elements as attributes. That's what we're going to use the jQuery for. Now, when the time comes to actually do this, I'll go back and forth between the style sheet and the JavaScript just to make sure that you're clear about what's going on. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Let's start creating some JavaScript. So we're going to place all of our JavaScript code inside of this self-executing JavaScript function, meaning we are writing our code in a way that ensures as soon as it loads into a web browser, it actually runs. This pair of parentheses right here has a lot to do with ensuring that that happens. Now we're going to create a list of variables using the single var pattern. And by that I mean we're going to use the var keyword once and attach a list of variables to it. And all these variables are going to be comma separated. When we're done creating that list, then and only then do we add a semicolon. And I'm going to type in var, and I'm going to add the ending semicolon right now just to make sure I don't forget it. So the first variable that I'm going to create is a reference to our document fragment. By the way, I'm just going to, just in the sake of time, because you can only have, your videos can only be so long on YouTube, I'm just going to write out the variables and then explain in the next video. But let's just get this list of variables out of the way right now. So I'm going to create a reference to our document fragment. I referred to it as a wrapper a few minutes ago. Wrapper is a great variable name for it in this case. So I'm going to say wrapper, you are equal to document create document frag. Oh, did not, whoops. Well, no, it's not going to. Document, there we go. Document fragment, perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to start creating our web page elements, JavaScript variables. The first element I'm going to create is a div tag, and I'm going to call that div tag outer div, and I'm going to say, oops, document, and to create a div tag, I'm going to use the createElement method, and the element that I want to create in this case is a div tag. The next element I'm going to create is a simple h1 tag, a header tag, and that variable is going to be named box header, and I'm going to use document create element again, and the element I want to create in this case is an h1 tag. The next element I'm going to create with a JavaScript variable is going to be another div tag, and I'm going to call that variable inner div. I'm going to set inner div equal to document dot create element, and I'm just going to create another div like we did at the top of our variable list. Now I'm going to create a simple text string which we're going to insert into our web page and among all these elements at some point. And to do that, I'm going to create a variable called copy document, and I'm going to introduce a new method in our code, but a method that we talked about at the beginning of this video called createTextNode. What's the text node I want to create? I'm going to be real original and have it say hello world. Okay, so we're actually done creating all of our variables. Now, as a reminder, we're done using JavaScript variables to create all of our web page elements. As a reminder, we want to load all these web page elements to the inside of this div with an ID name of container. I'm going to create a reference to this div in our variable list. Just it's a more optimal way of doing things in the context of the code we're writing here. So to do that, I'm going to create a variable called main node, and I'm going to set that equal to document, and I'm going to use the ever popular getElementById method. What ID do I want to get? Well, I got to learn how to spell it first. That would help. The ID I want to get is the one that is already on our web page and has an ID name of container. Okay, so we're done creating our list of variables for now. Let's start laying these out the way we want to lay them out. But that's going to be in the next video, so let's go to video 2.